Let's move to our next panel, highlighting the opportunities and challenges of Armenia's role in the new space era. Until the stage is ready, ladies and gentlemen, join me in welcoming our esteemed panelists, Mr. Masis Komrokian, former senior manager at Lockheed Martin Space, Mr. Babken Der Grigorian, acting director general at Geocosmos, Mr. Armen Rostamian, CTO at Cartes Analytica, Ms. Hanna Harutunian, founder of Rocket Space Academy, and Mr. Gernot Gromer, director of Austrian Space Forum. Our moderator for this discussion will be Mr. Rafi Kasarjian, founder and principal advisor at Sensian.
Okay, thank you very much for the warm welcome to our very esteemed panel. I'm actually very excited. My name is Rafi Kasarjian. I'm very excited to moderate this panel because this is a chance for all of us in this room to take a brief journey to space for the next 45 minutes and talk about how, what are the opportunities for Armenia in space exploration and space technology. You know, when one thinks of Armenia, you don't really associate Armenia with space right away. However, as many of the older folks in this room know, Armenian scientists and technologists worked on space guidance systems during the Soviet Union for many, many years. So at least we were intimately involved in what was happening in space. And of course, Viktor Hampartsumyan, our very famous academician and astrophysicist. So for today, what we'd like to do is explore what are the opportunities for Armenia in space, and we'll start with the fact that in July, Armenia was the 43rd signatory to the Artemis Accords, which is a group that was founded by the United States and seven other founding members, whose mission is to establish principles for cooperation in civil exploration and the use of the moon, Mars, comets, and asteroids for peaceful purposes. So very, this is not your typical technology conference panel discussion. I'm very, very excited to be here. So I think all of our panelists have been introduced, and I would like to ask the first question to Dr. Gromer. Dr. Gromer is with the Austrian Space Forum. He has extensive experience within the European Space Agency, Austrian Space Forum. He was also part of the team, and he'll talk a little bit more about this, with Armenia's first space launch last year. So Dr. Gromer, when we think about space, right, traditionally it's been the domain of governments and very large, complex organizations, very complex technology, billions of dollars or euros required to actually put technology into space. We've seen that changed over the last probably, 7, 8 years. And before we start talking about Armenia in particular, maybe you could, kind of give a little bit of context of what's happening in space technology and space exploration, and then we'll go from there. Thank you.
Well, what we see now is a massive transformation of the entire industry. As you said, space was believed that only governments can do it. This has changed. The sheer numbers are changing extremely right now. So as we speak, there are more than 8,000 active satellites orbiting our planet. And more of half of those satellites belong to a single company, which is SpaceX. So one company has more satellites than all the governments, all the other constellations together, and this number is steeply rising. There's a Euroconsult study that projects that in 2030 there will be 75,000 satellites orbiting the Earth. So this is really mind-blowing. And we also see a democratization of space. That's not only governments that are doing this, but there are many, many more universities, industrial groups, companies that are delivering services for us here on Earth that are launching satellites that do not need to be 1-ton mass. They don't have to be built in a clean room anymore. You can basically go online and build a virtual satellite and then order the parts commercially off the shelf. And that also means the business of space is expanding significantly. This year, we're probably going to be beyond the $500 billion threshold of the industry activities. And by 2030, we're talking about much more than 600 billion, well, rather 700 billion. So this is expanding. And at the same time, we see here down on Earth that space is not only about exploring Mars and these magnificent pictures of a James Webb telescope, which are, to me, magic, but they have become an integral part of our infrastructure here on Earth. I claim that everybody here in the audience today was already using at least half a dozen of space technologies or space-derived technologies without consciously realizing it. It's not about, are we going to do space activities? No, space has arrived in our society.
Excellent. Thank you for that broad overview. I'll turn next to Babkin Der Grigorian, who is the acting director of Geocosmos and also founder of Cardis Analytica. Babkin, now let's talk about sort of Armenia's objectives, right? We had the launch last year. We had the first sort of Armenia built component that went into space. Now with the work that's been done at Cardis Analytica and the plans for Geocosmos, talk a little bit about what are Armenia's objectives in investing in this new exciting area.
Sure. Thank you, Rafi. I think the number one takeaway here is that space and space activities for Armenia are not a luxury, it's an imperative. It's a national security imperative, it's an economic imperative for Armenia. We're a landlocked country, we have the sky and we have the space, and we need to maximize what we do there. And to follow on from Dr. Gromer's point, there has been a democratization of space, and this is a perfect opportunity for Armenia to make its next steps in there. In 2020, the government passed a law on space activities, which was a great first step. It established a skeleton regulatory framework for getting the sector moving. And of course, we've had ARMSAT-1, the first state-owned Armenian satellite, as well as the first private satellite that was actually built in Armenia. So there's things moving in that direction. For Armenia, what space gives us is the opportunity to really increase our independence, to really fast-track our economic growth, and to secure really crucial national security elements that we need for the future.
Excellent. That's a great setup for us. I'll turn next to Masis Komrokyan, who's formerly of Lockheed Martin's space, so a lot of experience in this space, pun intended. Masis, can you talk a little bit about what you see are Armenia's particular capabilities to enter into this space from the kind of the traditional space technology side? So what have you seen over the last few years in terms of what our kind of nascent capabilities are and what are capabilities that we're in the process of building?
Sure. Well, first, thank you, Rafi. And before I answer that question, I wanted to add on to one more thing that Babkin mentioned. Other than national security and the obvious reasons for getting into space, there's an economic impact. And I want to talk about that just for a moment, and then I'll talk about technology. So if we're looking at economic impact, there are all kinds of studies done that tells us that, based on NASA, ESA, UK, Canada, all these companies and countries that talk about investment in space and the return on that investment to the national GDP of those countries, the numbers are very interesting. It's 5 to 10x return on investment, which is, for any state, that's an impressive return. So, for example, if you look at healthcare, infrastructure, all these other state investments, they actually have less return on GDP than investing in space. So that's just something for Armenia to take into account. And another thing I wanted to add is, if we look at technology, which is a strategic direction that Armenia wants to go, let's look at the example of Silicon Valley. Silicon Valley, I don't think most people know, but it actually started with aerospace and space. When the government invested in space and through companies like Lockheed Martin, they built these huge facilities in Silicon Valley, and as soon as those companies started to need supporting companies, for example, semiconductor companies, that the space investment that the government made created semiconductor companies and then software companies, and that's how Silicon Valley started. So just something to keep in mind when we're talking about why it's important for Armenia. In terms of technologies, there's obviously we need to start first becoming a user. So we need to become a basic consumer of space technologies and then become an advanced user of space technologies so that we can start assembling, testing, and then eventually getting to developing and becoming a producer of space technologies. And some of those technologies would be remote sensing. Obviously, there's various payloads that can provide remote sensing. communications capabilities, ground stations, small sats in the form of CubeSats. There's also some, since we're at WCIT and the theme is AI, let's mention AI. AI here, there's many applications in space. If we're talking about on board, and this process has already begun, AI can be used on board satellites for helping with autonomous decision making, as opposed to having scripts that say, if this scenario happens, then this, if this happens, then that. We have AI on board, and it can drive some of that decision making, and it will rely less on ground communications. There's also a lot of image processing that can be done with AI, helping with doing some of the enhancing some of the imagery, doing some of the filtering, cloud detection, all kinds of interesting things, even with signal processing, with communications. There's many applications. And there's even more applications on the ground, I would say, if we're talking about AI and space technologies, but on the ground. And probably Admin would be much better at addressing some of those AI capabilities.
Yes, that's a great segue to Armin, the CTO of Cardis Analytica. So, Armin, we've talked a lot about, at this conference and previous conferences about Armenia's capabilities in technology, mostly software technology, and more recently in advanced technologies. So how does that position us to follow this opportunity for Armenia in space, given your expertise in cybersecurity and other areas that you've worked in over your career?
Okay, thank you for the wonderful question. Let me start by just kind of echoing back or addressing a few other things mentioned by Dr. Gromer, Masis, Bob Ken. So you made a very good observation, which is that in space, there's one company that has kind of an outsized presence right now, physically. My perspective is kind of more Silicon Valley feeling, maybe almost you could say kind of capitalistic view. But if you consider that that's some kind of market, then there's this one actor with this really big market share right now. If we look at space in this way, and now let's add the analogy of it being kind of like a startup. Why are startups attractive in the first place? The idea behind a startup is that a small, agile, nimble team with fewer resources and just better, let's say, creativity, intelligence, grit, dedication, they can beat someone 10 times their size and dominate a market. I see Armenia positioned that way in space. Yeah. We are a small country, but we're very capable, we're very intelligent, and we're very driven. And we can also have an outsized advantage in space, irrelevant of when we've started or what our size is. And to that effect, the model I operate through is essentially this startup concept. So the potential for Armenia, it's the same as Armenia kind of doing very well as it has been in other areas where there's opportunity for startups. Armenian startups are doing a great job. So for space, I see essentially the same idea for us, which is that we can enter this kind of new arena. And even though there are large entrenched players with this giant market share in this thing, we ourselves, being nimble, being smart, doing all the things a startup should be doing, we can then command an outsized advantage just by playing it right.
That's great. In fact, I want to come back to this a little bit later when Dr. Gromer said about the democratization of space. And in Silicon Valley, right, a lot of the success of individual startups actually lies in their cooperation and partnership and integration with other sort of technology providers. Before I get to that, but I definitely want to get to that, I'd like to turn to Hana Artunyan, the founder of Rocket Space Academy, Armenia's first analog astronaut, and I think it's actually very cool to be on stage with two people wearing sort of astronaut uniforms. Hana, if you could, before I get to the sort of main question, talk a little bit about your journey. How did you get to work both on a program in Austria with Dr. Gromer? You were part of the DigiTec2024 mission as well last year. So talk about your journey getting to where you got to, and then I'll ask you a little bit more about sort of how Armenia is playing in this space.
Thank you so much. First of all, I got the honor to be part of WCIT2024 this year. I did already 2 analog missions this year, and I met Gernot. And I was ground operations support there. I learned so much from Ocean Space Forum because I could say that it's one of the leading space agencies in Europe, and they are so professional. And after that, I got inspired to become an analog astronaut and went to Poland, got the invitation, and did my own analog mission where I was space engineer and crew member. It was a really revolutionary experience because I became the first Armenian analog astronaut, and actually I founded Rocket Space Academy to bring more analog astronauts into the field, more Armenian analog astronauts, because there are many missions out in the world, and we have the capacity, we have the strength, we have many beautiful, intelligent people that just we need to bring those opportunities for them. And I'm hoping to create one. And yeah, this is the journey of mine, what brought me here.
So how did you, so what's your background and how did you choose this particular path?
My background is in robotics engineering, and I did Enceladus mission. I was the lead systems engineer for NASA. And yeah, space was really dear to me from a very young age. I don't know how you guys got inspired by space, but I was watching Toy Story, and Buzz Lightyear was my favorite character. So I really wanted to bring his dream come true and bring him with me to space. That I'm not an astronaut yet, but I hope I will do that one day.
So can we call you Hannah Lightyearian as the first? That's actually very, very cool. Very cool. Dr. Gromer, let's talk a little bit about sort of comparative, looking at what's happening in Armenia in the context of what's happening globally, right? So you've been, I think you said this is your 5th trip to Armenia. You obviously were part of that very important mission last year. You worked with Hannah. How do you see kind of the talent base here, the capabilities, and then sort of where do we need to focus to advance?
I want to pick up on what you said before, and that is, yes, being a landlocked country and not having a strong, how should I put this, a way to incrementally increase the reach of a product, of a service or so, but you either have a regional market within the country or you go global. There's not that much in between. And this is exactly what space does. It does not matter where you are. You can literally build a CubeSat that is, I know of an example in Germany from one CubeSat company called AuroraTech that is doing wildfire detecting, flying infrared camera, straightforward. I'm sure there will be a few hundred students in Armenia already who could do the same thing. And the moment you are in orbit, you roll out globally, just by pure physics, because orbital mechanics dictates you have to be around the globe. That means your service becomes rolled out around the globe. And so you have I think, a very good substratum of an ecosystem of a strong history and tradition of technical education dating back decades, but is still palpable. What I also found as an external observer, and forgive me this directness because I see it from the
Please
European,
do, that's what we're looking for.
In Europe and Austria, we have a much stronger risk averseness of being afraid to fail. And maybe also because of this strong connection with Silicon Valley, with so many Armenians living in LA, and so there is a tradition that you're less afraid to fail, and you have this kind of a gung-ho attitude of let's just give it a try, and if it fails, let's do it again. And this is exactly how space research works as well. Fail fast, fail cheap, have a steep learning curve, rebuild and fly again. And that's exactly how SpaceX went big. Huh? Mm-hmm. So I think both the education ecosystem, the innovation ecosystem, the mindset ecosystem is just right. And I think you wouldn't maybe associate in the year 2024 Armenia with a spacefaring country, but it's about to be one. And I think the trend, the direction is the right one. And I think you have more substantial budgets in many ways, not the money, but the intellectual capacities,
resources
to do more.
Excellent. Actually, Hannah, I forgot to ask you, could you please define for the audience what an analog astronaut is?
Yeah, sure. So astronauts are people who are going to space and conducting space research to understand how can we operate and explore other planets. Analog astronauts are astronauts who are doing those researches on Earth in a simulated environment. So instead of spending billions of dollars to send few people to other planets and do the research, we are first simulating that on Earth. I did already lunar and Martian, and we had beautiful habitats which were like simulated really clearly, and it was almost like we were on Mars or Moon. And and we are learning from those experiments and learning what went wrong, what failed, what can we improve. So when we send those people to space, we won't fail and we won't lose anything. So, yeah.
Excellent, thank you. I'm going to start with Popkin with this question, but others, please feel free to jump in. Look, I love sort of very interactive panel discussions. We want to, keep the audience engaged as well. So we've been talking about sort of the art of the possible, right? What is possible for Armenia to develop and strengthen and build a space program. Let's sort of step back a little bit, talk about the challenges. Popkin, maybe you can start sort of in terms of environmental challenges that we have, and then we can move into some of the technical challenges as well.
Sure. So when we think about the challenges for developing the space industry in Armenia, I would first and foremost come to the policy environment, because a lot of what needs to develop is the right policy frameworks to be able to develop the private sector, but also to delineate between what is the role of the public sector in this, what is the role of the state in this, and what is the role of the private sector. We're not going to have a traditional or I guess a older model of a massive state space agency like NASA that has a monopoly, or as the behemoth in the room. Instead, and we don't need to, because Armenia has a very vibrant IT sector that can be very easily pivoted to develop its space sector. So in terms of challenges, obviously this has to do with the expertise that we don't have. We need to develop the expertise, and this is education policy. Then we need to have the definition of what are going to be those strategic directions that the state is going to be involved in, and what are the sectors there where the private sector can get involved. Unlike the IT sector, where it's a little bit like the Wild Wild West, where anyone opens a startup, really just ask the state to give them some tax credits and stay away. The space sector really does require active state involvement. But in a very different way than before. It requires a cooperative approach, and not just between the state and the private sector, but also among the private sector entities that exist. So, with the Artemis Accords, it was the first step in developing that sort of policy regulatory framework. But I'm sure that both Masis and Armin can elaborate more on that.
So
Please.
You want to go first? Go for it.
Sure, because I want to start with the capabilities, and then I want to just add that, and then we'll talk about challenges. So in terms of capabilities, 3 years ago, there was nothing really in Armenia space related. But in the past 2-3 years, there's been a huge jump, significant momentum. In the past 2 years, I just want to recap. In addition to the Mars analog mission, there was the first private effort to build and test and launch and operate a CubeSat, which is a HiSat-1, I think, which was a huge achievement. And there's also the government on their side. They also procured and own and are operating ArmSat-1. But what does that mean in terms of the momentum that's being created and the capabilities? The whole point of HiSat-1, which was a joint effort between CSI, the Center for Scientific Innovation and Education, and Bazunk, we basically brought together 10 local engineers, and we were able to do a tech demonstration to demonstrate that Armenia is indeed capable of getting into the space game. That was the entire purpose of it, is to show through collaboration we can actually, using our knowledge of software and hardware, and a little bit of assistance in terms of understanding the space domain and how to apply those technologies to that application, we're able to make that happen on the first try. That's quite rare, actually. Universities sometimes, they try and fail, but over time they're able to do it. So that's a huge achievement for Armenia. It's worth recognizing. And then I would say, I think we are ready to get into this because at this point, I think the building blocks are there from what I've seen, having spent the past 3 years in this area. If I need something coded, I could find a programmer, no problem. If I need PCB designed, I could find hardware engineers that can do that. We have the building blocks here in Armenia to really get into space and build on the momentum that we've already started. In terms of challenges, I would say, one is the concept of systems engineering. We really need to push that a little bit more. We have project management, and people usually confuse systems engineering with project management, or they confuse it with, I understand hardware and I understand software, and so I'm a systems engineer, but that's not what systems engineering is. And I think the more that we start learning and applying what systems engineering is in Armenia, we're going to be able to do more of these complex systems, aerospace, aeronautics, space. These are the complex systems. Automotive systems engineering is required here. So I think the more of that we do, I think it's going to assist in accelerating our achievements in all aerospace fields. And then I would agree that I think the other challenge is we need more of a long-term strategy, a 10-year strategic vision for where we want to be in space, 5-year plans, 1-year, 2-year action plans to how to get to where we want to be. And I think that's in process, actually. There's multiple, through ASOF, Prime Minister's Council, there's some activities there that are helping with the strategy, and of course, GeoCosmos now is going to be actively working that to develop a space strategy so that we can have the right direction and the building blocks are already being prepared for that.
Okay, Armin, from the software side, or sort of more the traditional tech side in terms of challenges?
Yeah, so I'm gonna be a little contrarian. You could say, for example, that one of the big challenges is that we don't have a kind of national level, long-term space heritage like they have in the United States. But to kind of flip that on its head, there's this thing that happens in technology. They call it like a leapfrog effect. So for example, in the United States, they had 56K modems with dial-up. Then they had one type of DSL. Then there was another type of slightly faster DSL. Then there was cable internet. And then eventually they adopted fiber optic communications for the general public. In Armenia, there was none of that, and we went straight to fiber. And this is kind of, our journey to fiber was...
Our journey to fiber was faster, I would say.
Much faster, right? And that's, maybe I overstated the point, but you get the idea. And I think if we look at it that way, that's not really so much of a challenge. It could, in fact, be an opportunity. The idea that there's no existing, sort of entrenched process or apparatus, and that we can start from relatively less and achieve much more quickly, that's way closer to the leading edge, is kind of my play on taking a challenge and turning it into an advantage. But there are, of course, other challenges. There's like legislation and policy. That's why we've got Bobkin around for some of that. For example, the government and specifically the Ministry of High-Tech Industry, they've been very receptive, they've been very proactive, they've been engaged in driving this. I think they deserve credit and acknowledgement for that engagement. And then the other challenges, everyone's already said it. We have all these kind of differentiators in Armenia. We've got very smart people. There's a long-standing heritage of education, mathematics, science. In the most kind of copied Armenian way, one of the big challenges, if we've got all that lined up, and we can even take a disadvantage and turn it into an advantage, I guess one of the remaining challenges in a very kosht way is kind of porimunat. We need money. This sector requires some capital investment upfront and long-term engaged investment, not like a spray and pray, let me just throw a few million here and hope that one 10x's. It needs dedicated long-term investment and investors and value-add kind of participants so that it has the opportunity to experience some setbacks and then thrive despite that anyway, in a way that's sustainable and long-term. Those are kind of the challenges I see. Otherwise, I mean, space requires lots of software. We're really good at that. Space requires some hardware as well. We've got lots of kind of background in that, and we might need some additional investment, but I think for me, that's kind of how I lay out the challenges. Thank you.
And if I could just add on one more thing to that. The sector has changed so fundamentally in the past 4 or 5 years. I mean, you mentioned 4,000 satellites currently, but I think the interesting data point there is that 10 years ago, there was 150 satellites. You know, and that, yes, 4,000 of them currently exist, 2,000 of them are one company, but the other 2,000 are a bunch of other private companies. So the problem has changed. You know, in the past, even just a few years ago, the problem, for example, if we're talking about remote sensing and Earth observation, the problem was how to get access to this data. Getting geospatial data and satellite-derived data was very hard to get and very expensive. That is a solved problem, essentially. But that means we need to solve the next problem, which is how do you analyze all that data? How do you make it useful for the people? And ultimately, whatever we do in the space activities in Armenia needs to have a benefit for the country and the people. And that's something that I think we can really eloquently capture with an effective space strategy. I think we'll come back to that in a little bit.
Definitely. Dr. Gromer, you know, Austria, another landlocked small country, but with much better skiing than Armenia. Maybe you could talk a little bit about how Austria started its space program and what are some the lessons that we could learn from that.
We had a starting advantage by being part of the European Space Agency since 1975. And so the lesson learned from this is, with the right partners, you can do everything, obviously. Now, we don't have an Austrian diaspora. That's an asset that Armenia really benefits from. And throughout the projects we've been doing here in Armenia with the MRD-24 Mars simulation, we really felt that actually the idea to come to Armenia was suggested by Armenians that worked in the European Space Agency. And also, and I also should point out that Heike Aslanian is here in the audience as well. He was the project manager from the Armenian side for MRD-24. Also, he was at the Ministry for High Tech previously. He's one of the people responsible laying out the groundworks for the first Armenian satellite. So there is a heritage building up right now. So it's about finding the right partners. It's about identifying what are the niches where we can push forward. No country, and not even the United States or Russia or anybody, can do everything alone. We see that at the International Space Station. It means that a focus on the right choices is as important as in any IT field, for instance. That's one thing. The other thing I think that we saw within MRD-24 really on the ground when talking to people on the streets, when we do public presentation, is there needs to be some attractive highlight, something that is really sexy. And the way Hungary is doing this, for instance, is they put into the national space strategy to put up a Hungarian astronaut by the next 2 years, basically. And this was a long process previously, when you go through the process of the European Astronaut Corps and then wait for a flight opportunity. Well, hell, with a few million, you can fly on Axiom Space with 2 weeks of crash training. I mean, if somebody comes up with a bucket of money, Hannah would be at Christmas time. She could be at the space station.
I like that.
Hopefully with the return flights.
Just imagine
A couple $1 million.
what role model somebody like Hannah could be for the next generation of Armenian engineers and explorers. I mean, I think it's pretty easy to identify 1 or 2 of those highlight projects. If you focus on those, there's nothing that can stop you.
Excellent, excellent. Popkin, and actually Masis alluded to this. I know that Armenia is in the process of developing this sort of 5-year, 10-year, plan. What's our North Star? If we look at it today, so what are we aiming to? Obviously the most famous example of this is Kennedy saying we'll land on somebody on the moon in 10 years, right? And everything got mobilized at the national level to make that happen. Do we have an idea of where we want to go, even if it's not fully baked yet?
Okay, I see the deputy minister's looking at me, and I don't think I should make any big policy announcements right now, but
aspirational.
Aspirational. I mean, I think what we want is a vibrant space sector in Armenia, but we want a national body that is engaged in strategic activities for space. We want a private sector that is not just supporting that, but also vibrant on its own right. We want to make sure that the activities of the space activities that we are engaged in are benefiting Armenia and the Armenian people and the state. One of the cornerstones of that is going to be a well-defined national space program and a national space agency, which we're in the process of doing. I think one of the things that the Artemis Accords provides us is support and a community to help us develop that. We thought originally we were lobbying essentially for Armenia to join the Artemis Accords. We thought that was going to be the sort of end of the story, but actually it's just the very beginning. If we want to talk aspirational and sexy, I think it's not out of the realm of possibilities to envision an Armenian flag on the moon in the next 20 years. But this is something that would probably happen within the framework of international cooperation with the Artemis Accords and the Artemis program, which the Accords are meant to sort of help develop. But you cited John F. Kennedy's speech, we choose to go to the moon not because it is easy, but because it is hard. The second part of that speech actually says that the reason why we're doing this is because it is something that helps us organize our society and give us that direction to help us mobilize the economic resources, but also the human capital resources to make sure we are focusing on the STEM education from an early age, to make sure we're developing the expertise and the capacity locally to be able to do all the things. So without getting into too much details about what the ultimate North Star is going to be, I think I can paint a picture of what some of the pillars are that we're going to be focusing on. Of course, it's going to include developments in space assets, in ground assets that support space assets, but also in how to work with satellite data and geospatial data to actually have tangible benefits for people on the ground.
Very good. Hannah, your background in robotics, right? So as you got into this and as you participated in these international programs, what did you wish you had more of in Armenia that would have prepared you better for it? So if you're looking ahead and we want to have 15, 20, 100 more Hannahs coming up in the next few years, what should we be doing as a country to make that happen?
That's a really interesting question, and being involved in those two missions got me really good insights what we are lacking in Armenia. In Armenia, we don't have that kind of background. We don't have space-related majors. We are creating one. We are really in an early stage of those development, and other countries are already ahead of us. But I see a truly big potential that we can do this, and we need to start, education starts from family. And I want to approach all of the parents that are watching this that you need to encourage, not force, but motivate your children to pursue space. Because many people don't know what space is, what space sector is, what can they do. Like, for example, when I announced that I became first astronaut, they said, why? And we need to, first of all, from our families, educate our children, us, that space is a really crucial, important sector in the world, and we need to start getting involved in that. Maybe we don't need to become space engineers and physicists, because for space we need all kinds of professionals. We need lawyers, we need science communicators, and we need chemists, biologists, so you don't really need to go and become aerospace engineers to be involved in space. You just need to have that space passion, space enthusiasm, which is coming from a very deep down from your heart. And which is related to education. I would love to see programs starting from kindergarten, starting from elementary school, high school, to have those programs, maybe optional, but people can be interested in that and maybe think about pursue that as their profession. And I'm really looking forward to have majors in our universities, because we have some introductory programs, and I honestly attended one of them, and they are really complicated. Space is not that complicated. We need to make space more accessible. We need to create those programs, those majors, more accessible. So you don't really need to have 6 years of engineering background to understand what space is. So I'm really looking forward to have those kind of opportunities those kind of programs, which will not only teach them about space, about engineering, about physics, but also to tackle their interests. Because if I want everyone to not think that space is boring or math is hard, that's not true. I want everyone to be excited and interested on that, and I'm really looking forward to contribute my knowledge. And I studied at International University of Germany, and in my university it's really different, and I'm ready to bring that experience, that knowledge here in Armenia.
Oh, I think we have to applaud that. That was fantastic. And I think for the policymakers in the room, you know, in software, and Armin's very well aware of this, you know, we're everything switched to sort of customer-centric design, customer-centric product management. Here's our customer, right? So we need, what do we need to do to create more HANAs? Fantastic. Armin, on that point, actually, you talked about sort of, you know, that it's really a combination of different types of technologies, and not one entity or not one organization, not one company is going to do it all, right? Can you sort of unpack that a little bit about sort of what are those building blocks that we should really place bets on?
Right. Great question. I'm probably going to need an assist from Masis on this at some point. But I guess if we kind of take your question and the last one that you posed to Bobkin. So space is a very broad subject. If we're thinking about how do we spin up a real space kind of vision for Armenia, one of the big questions is asking, well, what is it we want to do? Like in any software project, in any product, in any company, you have this
What
broad...
problem are you solving, right?
Yeah, exactly. And in the beginning, whatever it is that you pitch is very rarely the same thing you land on if you find your feet and get some traction. So the first thing is to be very strategic and intentional about what we want to focus on. Yes, and for example, there's a technology. It was originally top secret and used by the US military. Now it's commercially available. It lets you put some instruments on a satellite in space, and then you can essentially take pictures, very high resolution pictures of Earth, but you can take them at night and you can see through clouds. So you kind of have like Batman, Superman, X-ray vision in space. This is a relatively new technology. Here in Armenia, there's definitely the necessary knowledge, desire, and capacity to take that technology and run with it. For example, to find a way to make it better, to perfect it, to innovate it, and to make that like one of our key differentiators, let's say. But in general, all the things it would take, I guess was the question, to kind of unpack and make successful. So if someone
Pretty briefly, sorry, we're kind of running out of time.
Sure.
Pretty briefly.
Yeah, I mean, just the way I would look at it is look and smell something like NASA or the European Space Agency, behave, act, and move something like SpaceX. That would be kind of the short recipe.
Perfect. I'll take that as your closing remarks. I'm going to turn to each of the panelists. Dr. Gromer, perhaps we can start with you. Kind of what is your one recommendation for Armenia to do this right?
I think my recommendation would be to accept that space is already on Earth. In a way, we are part of it. Actually, you are all astronauts of the spacecraft Earth, and we need to take care of our spacecraft, otherwise we are doomed. And that also is combined with a vision I would like to share, and that is, let's say in the next 20 to 30 years, we're going to expect the first human robotic mission to Mars. That means if we assume the person who will take the first step then will be, like, say, 30, 40, 50 years old, it means that the very first human to walk on Mars is already born. The crew for the most ambitious journey we've ever undertaken as a society, this crew exists already, they just don't know it yet. So this person who will do the first step is right now maybe going to elementary school, maybe in Yerevan. Who knows? Nothing is stopping us from that thought. And if you think this is science fiction, one last fun fact to conclude with is, are you all aware, everybody in this room who is younger than 25 years never had a single moment in his or her life where all humans were on Earth at the same time, because the space station is permanently crewed. So by the standards of our grandfathers, we are already living in a science fiction world.
Fantastic. That was excellent. Thank you. Masis, very briefly, kind of what are your recommendations? What should we do?
Thank you. There's two things I want to point out, and I think the first thing, or emphasize really, is space is, at this point for Armenia, space is not optional. I tie space with the independence of Armenia. So if you want sovereignty, if Armenia wants sovereignty, it wants independence, space is mandatory here, because otherwise your situational awareness, what's happening in and around Armenia, we can't be have a lack of understanding in that, or delayed understanding of that situational awareness. And satellites and space technology gives us that. Secure communications, we can't have communications that are dependent on others, that can be cut off. So it's very important for us as a nation to understand that space and any improvements in our space abilities and capabilities, that's adding to the independence and sovereignty of Armenia. So that's number one, and what we need to understand. And number two, more on the micro level, at the individual level, yes, space is exciting, space is interesting. There's so much potential there. I mean, we're still, when it comes to the future of space technology and its applications, we're in its infancy still. Despite having, since World War II, or having all that experience, we're still in its infancy. So this is a huge potential for Armenia. And I think what I would like to express to the audience and to everyone listening is the brightest minds in Armenia need to come work in the space industry. That's very important, that we're understanding the significance of space, and the top talent should come talk to us about working in the space industry, because that's where the future is.
Thank you, Masis. Popkin, and let's keep it short if we
I'm
can.
going to keep it very short, and seconding what everyone else said. The Armenian National Space Program is coming. Stay tuned. Please talk to us, and let's do this together. I'll keep that short and sweet.
Excellent. Thank you. Hannah, any last thoughts? I think your last statement was perfect. If there's anything you'd like to add that I forgot to ask, please do so now, and we'll close with that.
Yeah, I will keep it short, and I wanted to say that I fully agree with my colleagues, and I'm looking forward to it, and I'm really looking forward to have space entrepreneurship, because we have non-profits, and we really need entrepreneurship. We really need space business models in Armenia, because who's gonna pay those bills? So yeah, let's create that together, and thank you so much.
Perfect ending to the panel, Hannah. So I have to tell you, I do this a lot. This has probably been my favorite panel to moderate. The subject was very interesting. You were all very engaging, and I hope everyone in the audience enjoyed it. Thank you very much. Have a great afternoon.
Your discussion has changed our perspective on Armenia's role in space exploration. Thank you all for sharing your insights.